Welcome back, Wolfpack. Verlis here, and this is how to use Palkia. So Palkia is the other Sinnoh legendary Pokemon, and it is the ruler of space. It also kind of resembles something naughty and phallic. Anyways, if we look at the stat distribution and compared to Dialga, it's going to be reversed in some interesting ways. That Dialga had 100 on the base hit points and 90 on the speed. Palkia is going to have 90 on the hit points and 100 on the speed. So ever so slightly less tanky, but then it's also going to be a bit faster. And the way I feel about it is 100 is a decent speed tier to consider when you're trying to like outspeed other Pokemon and start thinking about being a sweeper. Once you get to 110, that's going to be really good. I feel like 115 to 120 is where the real sweepers start to shine, but 100 is going to be better than 90, and it is worth investing into if you want to play that game. Also, it does have that switch around with 100 in defense and 120 in special defense instead of vice versa with Dialga, but still, we just have a 120 attack sitting there, and I don't think we're really going to do much with it. But overall, Palkia does have some pretty good stat distribution. Look at its typing, it's a water dragon type. Now, why are there not more water dragon Pokemon? We have this and Kingdra, and that's it. But it's such a cool sounding typing. We have the water dragon, and it's also a very solid typing as well. That you have two weaknesses, dragon and fairy. Now, it used to be better before the fairy typing that you were only weak against dragon, which was pretty insane. But the fairy, it's kind of a nerf, but it's not the worst thing that could happen. But you don't have as many resistances as Dialga. Dialga has two weaknesses and a ton of resistances. Palkia, two weaknesses, but then only resisted to steel, fire, and water. And it also isn't going to coverage out pretty well against Dialga either, but Dialga coverages back. So it's going to be an interesting trade between them, that Dialga versus Palkia. Dialga kind of has the edge, but Palkia is still going to be very usable. Hopping into Pokemon Showdown, we can kind of see that Palkia is in the same situation as Dialga as well. That with Palkia, it's going to be a Pokemon that has a very high special attack, 150, and if you invest it with the Modest Nature, and you give it the Lustrous Orb, so it's going to boost your Water and Dragon type attacks by 20%, so they get stabbed, they get all this extra bonus damage, and it's going to be pretty powerful, except even with very powerful moves, you're not always going to find neutral KOs, which means you're going to be reliant on coverage. However, Palkia and Dialga, they have excellent coverage. So we have moves like Earth Power, we have moves like Aura Sphere, and then we can just, the list goes on. Now with Palkia, you do get Hydropump, which does work out pretty well, but then you can just add Flamethrower, Thunderbolt, Ice Beam, Blizzard, Thunder, any kind of moveset you want here. You even have Focus Blast, you have Aura Sphere, so depending if you want like the perfect accuracy move, or 50% more damage for the less accurate move. And there's just kind of a lot of preferences that you can play around with Palkia and Dialga. So you go for the high coverage. Whatever you need to fill in for your team, or whatever Pokemon generally beat up on your team, you can try to fill in. So, you know, you just throw out like Flamethrower and then Earth Power or something. Actually, Flamethrower and Earth Power is kind of like stacking too much. I feel like you either get the ground or the fire, and then you put in that other. So we have like Flamethrower or Sphere or something. I could go over to Pokemon DB and really try to find the specifics, but really with Palkia or Dialga, you're playing for that super effective coverage damage or just high base power, so it's really how it's going to fit in with your team. That you either build the team around Palkia, or Palkia just has to naturally fit in with it, or else you're not going to find too much success. Now, as for running Palkia tankily, I'm not feeling it. Dialga has amazing resistances, but Palkia, it has slightly less hit points. It's still a very tanky Pokemon. It might be a 2-hit, 3-hit KO, even without too much investment, depending on the Pokemon attacking it, and if you're not getting hit super effective. So you can play around it really well. But here's where the problem comes in. If you're using a move like Spatial Ren, it's going to be very reliable. 95% accuracy and 100 base power, better than Dragon Pulse, and it has a high critical hit ratio, so you do get a little bit more of a chance of finding that crit. Goes from 6.25% to 12.5%, so a little bit extra damage. Like, it's 1 in 8 chance that you just go and land a nice crit, and that's not bad at all. But overall, your damage isn't going to be very high neutral KOing. Now, if you're wanting neutral KOs, that's when we look at Draco Meteor, but even then, we'll need a Life Orb to find more specific KOs. A Pokemon like Mega Kangaskhan not going to get one-hit KO'd by a Draco Meteor from a Modest Nature Palkia, even if it's holding the Lustrous Orb. But if you do have the Life Orb, it is going to be just a bit more damage, and it makes it towards like 75% chance to KO without hit point investment. So that's kind of what we're dealing with here, and that's another weird thing about the breakdowns of all these super effective moves, that when you're hitting neutrally on Draco Meteor, nothing else really matters. That 130 base power, well, that's going to get stabbed and then go to over 200 power. so that's on a neutral hit. Aura Sphere, 80 base power, that's doubling from a super effective hit, no stab, so it's only 160. So using Aura Sphere on Kangaskhan isn't going to be as strong as a Draco Meteor. However, if you do go for the Focus Blast, that's going to be more powerful, more reliable KOs. So those are the weird things you have to consider when you're running Palkia. And then we can just kind of look at that for the other things. Flamethrower, it's going to want to be a 4-time super effective hit. Same with like Ice Beam. Thunderbolt is a bit more interesting for cases, but you're really not going to find too much usage for it. So it's like Flamethrower, Ice Beam, your Aura Sphere, or your Earth Power. Earth Power is great for Heatran and some other Pokemon that can kind of resist you out. Hydropump, it's still going to be very powerful as well. 110 base power with a stab, going to go into a little under super effective range for most of these moves. So that is what we're considering, and that's where we go to Lustrous Orb or Life Orb. If we're running Life Orb, then that means all these moves are getting boosted, but we are losing a little bit of health. However, I think on Palkia, it's worth it. That when we're running Dialga, it's more of a tanky Pokemon, so we don't want to be taking that. But with Palkia, if we're running for that speed, that means we can switch things up a bit. We can run a Timid Nature, we can run that Life Orb, and now we're just looking for the super effective coverage. So as long as we're landing the very strong Hydro Pumps, potentially Draco Meteor, but again, with Draco Meteor, it's going to lower your special attack by 2, so unless you're using Palkia for revenge, that you bring as revenge, use Hydro Pump, Flamethrower, or Sphere, whatever move card you have here to finish off your opponent, then you go with a fresh Draco Meteor for the KO on the opponent coming in. That's kind of what you want to use Draco Meteor for. If you just want to have Palkia as a standard Pokemon, then it's good to keep the Spatial Wren, because just reliable damage, you hit it, and you're good to go. Now, Draco Meteor is going to be slightly less damage after the special attack drop. So 130 base power, and then you cut that in half to 65, so it becomes 195 base power in 2 uses, compared to the Spatial Wren, 100 plus 100, so 200 base power, and Spatial Wren has that extra benefit of not lowering your special attack, which means you can run a damaging move, and then go Spatial Wren, and then go back to a different damaging move. So it keeps your coverage balanced, while also not being able to gate you too hard, and then it doesn't have that one-shot potential though, so that's where the risk-reward comes in. Do you just want to keep using it consistently and edging out slightly more on the damage, or you just want to come in for that huge blow-up move, switch out, and then do whatever? So damage calculations can get weird again depending on how we're running it, and that's where we also go back to the Choice Scarf. Choice Scarf is going to give us outspeeds on a lot of Pokemon, but then we almost have to run the Draco Meteor, or we always have to be fighting those super effective KOs. So that's the weird thing about these higher special attacks. That even non-legendary Pokemon, when we review them, we see like a 140 to 160-ish on the special attack. We're like, wow, this Pokemon's going to be great. But after you factor in Stab, and unless you're using Life Orb and always outspeeding the opponent, you're not really finding the neutral hits that you need, even though it seems like you should. So that just kind of shows the differences between where all these moves come in. Even a Pokemon like Greninja, it does technically get Stab on all of its moves, and that does boost its damage, but still has to hit super effective against many Pokemon. But Palkia is a legendary Pokemon, which means you're going to be using it with other legendary Pokemon, which also have absurd base stats. So that's where you're just going to have to break it down. Mostly it's just going to be running offensive with these Pokemon. That's your decision if you want to take the Life Orb chip damage, just go with the Lustrous Orb, or even Choice Scarf it. I like the Life Orb on Palkia with the Timid Nature, still gives you a lot of options. You will still find neutral KOs with the Draco Meteor, so the Revenge is good, but Spatial Wren, you know, you do have that tankiness. You Spatial Wren, and you're pretty much just good to go. So Hydropump, we didn't really talk about that too much, but it's just an excellent move, adds to your coverage, and it gets stabbed with the high base power, so that and Life Orb, still pretty powerful. And that's really what we're looking at. So in that, you know, Ice Beam, we have all kinds of crazy moves you can put in right here, because Palkia and Dialga have great coverage. So depending on what you need to explore for your team is where this Pokemon is going to shine. As for like double battles and synergies and stuff, it's just an attacker. Like, it's a bulky sweeper Pokemon, and it's going to be fairly one-dimensional in that regard, that the biggest decisions are going to be the moves, and that you're just pumping out damage and hoping your opponent goes down. You don't. You kind of cheese in some extra damage, or maybe you try to get a pseudo sweep in there. Because Palkia doesn't have access to anything like Dragon Dance or any stat boosting like other legendary Pokemon or other Pokemon in general, it's not going to overrun a team, but it's going to be a nice solid Pokemon, good amount of bulk, reliable damage, excellent coverage, and that's what you want to use it for. So if you guys enjoyed this video, that's how you use Palkia, and I hope you all have a nice day. Thank you for watching.